1 Samuel chapter 24, please, if you have a Testament, turn back with me. Again, let me give a little brief background. David's journey to the throne of the nation Israel has so far been a long and a difficult one. The first sign of Saul's hostilities toward David were way back in 1 Samuel chapter 18 when he hurled a spear at him. And ever since then, friends, his attempts to find, capture and eliminate David have all been frustrated. Remember last week, having fled to the wilderness of Maon, chapter 23, with Saul in hot pursuit, David now finds himself surrounded. Just when it seems he would be captured, the Lord wonderfully intervened. There came a messenger unto Saul that the Philistines had invaded the land. Saul is now forced to abandon the chase and attend to the enemy, allowing David to escape and to live in the strongholds of En-gedi. Let's come to our verses. David spares Saul's life, 1 Samuel chapter 24. Friends, after the Philistine threat had been dealt with, Saul returned to hunt for David and is told that David, is in the desert of En-gedi. The wilderness of En-gedi was a wild place of cliffs and caves which were often used to shelter sheep. Saul took 3,000 chosen men from all Israel and set out to look for David and his men near the crags of the wild goats, verse 2. David, as we know, had about 600 men with him at the time, which gave Saul a 5-to-1 numerical advantage. Now, the term here, chosen men, refers to the best of the best, the military elite, the nation's best. Saul had chosen 3,000 out of all Israel to hunt down the one whom the Lord had chosen out of all Israel. Verse 3, the narrative suddenly now becomes remarkably detailed. He came to the sheep pens along the way. A cave was there, and Saul went in to relieve himself. While they're in the desert hunting for David, nature calls, and Saul goes into a cave for a royal bathroom break, if I can say it like that. These things are necessary even for kings. Now, the law of Moses was very strict when it came to matters of sanitation, especially in the army camp, Deuteronomy 23 verses 12 to 14. But we are normally spared being told about it, aren't we? Why are we told then on this occasion? Why are we told on this occasion? The reason this occasion, you see, was interesting was because of the cave Saul happened to choose. Of all the caves in the region of En-gedi, and I'm sure there were many, many, Saul chose to come into this one, alone and vulnerable. David and his men were far back in the cave, verse 3b. In the darkness, deep inside the cave, there were whispers, verse 4a. The men said, "This is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish." Saul, for a long time, has been looking for an opportunity to kill David. Now David has the opportunity to kill Saul. The roles are reversed. Here was the chance, friends, to get even. And that's exactly what David's men encourage him to do, to take his sword and to kill Saul. They even tell him, look, if you're following, God has provided this opportunity for you. Let me stop there. Friends, is it possible to misinterpret the providence of God? Is it possible to misinterpret the providence of God? Because David's men did just that. This opportunity, which has presented itself to them, may have seemed reasonable, but David interpreted the providence of God in a different manner. No one would have blamed David for killing the mad tyrant. In fact, most people would have applauded him for it. We must never claim God's providential leading or protection as an excuse for wrong action. David knew of no command from God to take the kingdom by force. In this situation, David put the Lord first and not his own ambitions. Saul, as we know, would have had no qualms if the roles had been reversed. After all, he'd already ordered David's assassination several times, chapter 19, verse 1, verse 11, verse 20. And his ability to carry out such a thing was demonstrated, was it not, with the priests of Nob, chapter 22. Instead of taking Saul's life as he lay resting in the cave, David crept up unnoticed and cut off a corner of his robe. But notice again, even slicing off a piece of Saul's robe was an action for David too far. For afterward, David was conscience-stricken. His heart smote him. Why? Because he had cut off Saul's skirt. He had cut off the corner of his robe. The Authorized Version reads, David's heart smote him. David had a sensitive conscience, for his heart smote him. His heart, friends, brought conviction for doing what he did, even though he did Saul no harm. David, with his sword, had just snipped Saul's robe, yet it brought conviction and condemnation. His heart smote him. Can I suggest, please, a heart that smites us is a blessed and a merciful thing. A conscience that is awake and tender is a blessing, friends, for it will prove to be a means of preventing and leading us into greater sins. Verse 6. He said to his men, the Lord forbid that I do such a thing. The Lord forbid that I do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lift my hand against him, for he is the anointed of the Lord. Notice, please, verse 6, how many times David speaks to these men and mentions the name of Jehovah. 3 times over he's speaking of the Lord. Even though Saul was out to do David harm, even though Saul is a terrible king right now, he is still the king. He is still God's anointed. There's a saying in the military, you don't salute the man, you salute the rank. And David wasn't going to put his hand upon Saul, lest in effect he was laying his hand upon God himself. Verse 7, with these words, David rebuked his men. David restrained his men and did not allow them to attack Saul. And Saul left the cave and went on his way. When Saul was far enough away from the cave that he was safe, verse 8, David came out of the mouth of the cave. David addresses Saul, friends, in a manner consistent with how he intended to treat him. You see, the actions of a man will reveal what sort of character he is and what is in his heart. What was in David's heart is revealed by the words here that are now recorded. Verse 8a, he addresses Saul as my Lord, the King. Do you see it? He bows down with his face to the ground as an expression of humility and respect before the king. Verse 8b. David tells Saul how he refused to harm him, even when his men urged him to do so. Verse 10. Some urged me to kill you, but I spared you, he says. Again, verse 11, David calls Saul master and goes on to call him father. Fancy that. David, you remember, is Saul's son-in-law, and so is reminding him of their family relationship. He also shows Saul the cut-off corner of his robe, verse 11, as proof of the mercy he had shown him and his refusal to harm him. Holding the cut-off robe could also be seen as a symbol of David's innocence, his faithfulness and kindness. Verse 11b. Now understand and recognize that I am not guilty of wrongdoing or rebellion, but you are hunting me down to take my life, Saul, David says. Verse 14, whom are you pursuing? David points out, here look, verse 14, that he's no more of a threat to the king than a dead dog or a flea. Verse 12, may the Lord judge between you and me. David was content to leave justice and vengeance to the Lord. He would not take the life of Saul, for that prerogative belonged to the Lord. The Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away. Verse 15. May the Lord be our judge and decide between us. May he consider my cause and uphold it. May he vindicate me from your hand. When Saul hears these things, he asks, is that your voice, David, my son? He normally addresses David as the son of Jesse, doesn't he? But here he says, is that your voice, David, my son? For a moment, friends, Saul was overcome, and he wept aloud, verse 16. Saul, friends, as we know, had much innocent blood on his hands from his hatred of David. Was Saul's heart now softening? Verse 17, you were more righteous than I, he said. You have treated me well, but I have treated you badly. He goes on to admit that the Lord had delivered him into the hand of David, who had spared him. He affirms, verse 20, that David would be king of Israel, and asks him, verse 21, to promise mercy to his descendants. Now swear to me by the Lord that you will not cut off my descendants or wipe out my name from my father's family, he says. After David solemnly swore that he would do this, Saul returns home, but David and his men went up to the stronghold. Those are the verses. Friends, in preparation for this passage, I noticed how closely it paralleled another passage of Scripture, Romans 12, verse 17 to 21. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everybody. Do not take revenge, my friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, it's mine to avenge, I will repay, says the Lord. I wonder if Paul was actually thinking about 1 Samuel 24 when writing those verses. Here's the application. And this might be strong medicine, but sometimes strong medicine is needed, isn't it? One of the great tests of Christian living comes when we have been wronged and someone has hurt us. How do we react? How do we react? Are we tempted to take matters into our own hands? To seek revenge and get even? Do we allow bitterness to fill our heart? Can I ask you gently, and you answer it honestly, are you still brooding over something said or done to you years ago? Are you still brooding over something said and done to you years ago? And I examine my own heart, please. I once read a story about a wise old monk and his young apprentice who were walking together along a forest trail. Their monastery friends had a strict rule forbidding all contact with women. Coming to a river with a fast-flowing current, they saw an elderly lady weeping near the shoreline. As she couldn't cross over on her own, she asks for help. Without a word, the older monk went over, picked up the lady and carried her to the other side. Then she went on her way, while he and his young apprentice continued on their journey. 3 hours had passed without a word being spoken, but inside the young monk was seething. When he could no longer contain himself, he blurted out, "My lord, why did you carry that lady across the river? You know the strict rules. We are not even to touch a woman." The wise older monk stopped and looking down at his young apprentice said, I put her down 3 hours ago. Why are you still carrying her? It's a good question, isn't it? Without a word, the older monk went over, picked up the lady and carried her to the other side. She then went on her way, while he and his young apprentice continued on their journey. 3 or 4 hours had passed, without a word being spoken. But inside, you see, that young monk was tamping. When he could no longer contain himself, he blurts out, My Lord, why did you carry that lady across the river? You know the rules. We're not even to touch a lady, let alone carry one. The wise monk stopped, looking down at his young apprentice, said, I put her down 3 hours ago. Why then are you still carrying her? Can I ask you gently, please, are we still carrying burdens and resentments from the past? Not 3 hours ago, not 3 weeks ago, 3 months ago, 3 years ago, you know. But 23 years ago, 33 years ago. Isn't it time, friends, we put them down once and for all? Where are we then in this passage this afternoon? There's not one of us here who hasn't been hurt. There's not one of us here who hasn't been hurt, disappointed. The flesh, you see, and the world are like David's men. They cry out for revenge. Our natural instinct is to strike back and to seek revenge, isn't it? Our actions, our speech, our words will reveal our character and our heart. How's it with you? How's it with me? David did things God's way. He had a sensitive conscience. He had a fear of God. He displays love, grace, compassion and forgiveness. He had a contented spirit to leave justice, vengeance and the outcome with the Lord. And Christian brother, Christian sister, that's exactly what we are called to do. I don't want to be cavalier about this, please. But this is what we've got to do. There are many enemies against the church today, even within the church. And God knows every one of them. We've all been hurt and offended by someone's actions. And somewhere down the road, friends, in the providence of God, the opportunity will present itself for us to get even, to get our pound of flesh. Can I say this gently? A so-called Christian who can hurt others with their words and deeds is either out of God's will or is not a Christian at all. To have Jesus as our King means we follow Christ's example in loving our enemies, returning good for evil rather than seeking revenge. Remembering the words of 1 Peter chapter 2 verse 21. To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. Behind the example of Jesus is the example of David. For his name's sake.